Hello, this is Julius from Basic Financials. Following on from my last videos on lasting powers of attorney, and the same sort of theme, a little bit morbid I suppose, but just a little bit talk about probate or not probate, as the case may be, when somebody dies and there's a will in place. Now, first thing to say, I'm not a solicitor, so I'm not giving legal advice, but I've had some experience, and I've asked people at the probate office on certain of the questions that I'm going to talk to you about today, and had conflicting advice from the probate office, totally conflicting advice. So I decided, well, I'm going to look at the legislation and look at the guidance on the forms and make up my own mind based on what seems to be the intent of everything that's going on. So that's where I'm coming from, but I'm not a legally qualified solicitor, so there's a little bit of a qualification there. Now, you don't always have to get probate. That's the first thing to say. The reason why you might get probate, I'll take a step back. Probate is a legal document that confirms to organisations that you are as an executor entitled to administer what the instructions under the will. So that's what probate is. It takes about 8 weeks to apply for. Now, the only reason you would need probate is if there are things that need to be administered under the will that an organisation needs proof of, that you're entitled to make those or ask them to do it, and that might not always be appropriate. For example, if you've got say you've got a husband and wife that live in a property, live in their home. They've got a bank account and a savings account, and they own their house, and this is important, as joint tenants as opposed to tenants in common. You'll come across that distinction. Joint tenants means that you both own the whole house, whereas tenants in common mean that effectively one person owns a distinct part and the other person owns a distinct part. Now the difference is that on death, if you have a joint tenants, then on death, because it's joint ownership, the other owner automatically takes ownership of the whole. Now, if you have tenants in common, that's different, because it might be left to the other person in the will, but it might not, and it's a distinct separate asset effectively, so in the other person's name, and it doesn't automatically pass to the other person. So if you imagine a joint bank account where you've just got two people's names on the bank account, it doesn't necessarily need to be husband and wife, but in this case it's husband and wife. When one person dies, legal ownership automatically passes for the whole to the other person. That's like the house when it's joint tenants, not tenants in common. So going back to this example, you've got this husband and wife. They've got their house owned jointly as joint tenants. They've got a bank account, current account in joint names, and they've got a savings account in joint names. The bank and the land registry, they don't need any proof to show that you're doing things under the will as executor, because they automatically pass to the other person. So therefore, you don't need to get probate. What the will says makes no difference, because the will could say, I want the other half of the bank account to go to somebody else, but because it's a joint bank account, and if you haven't done anything to specifically say when the setting up of the bank that's what you want to happen, then it won't, because it doesn't come under the will, because it's not. This will be important later on when I talk about the administration of the will and probate application. Whereas where a distinction with how owning a house as tenants in common is important, because the other spouse could actually ask when they die for their portion of the house, what they own, to go to somebody else. Now, some people do that because it then protects that part from care home fees and things like that. Well, not just care home fees; it protects it from other things as well. But so that's you might not need probate. Is the first thing to say. If you do need to get probate, if there's inheritance tax payable, and I'm not going to go into the detail of when inheritance tax is payable because it's a whole nother subject. But if there is inheritance tax to pay, you have to have sorted that out. That doesn't necessarily mean paid all of the inheritance tax, but it does mean sorted it out with HMRC and agreed how things are going to get paid. That needs to be sorted out before probate is granted. There are IHT inheritance tax forms which get filled out if inheritance tax is payable. Now, if there isn't inheritance tax payable, there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. It might be because the estate is not over the nil rate band or bands, or it might be that everything is being passed to the spouse. And if everything's being passed to your spouse, then that's exempt. That gift to a spouse is exempt from inheritance tax. So therefore, there might not be inheritance tax to pay on the first death. If that is the case, then you can apply for probate online and submit the values of the estate at the same time within that form, and not have to do a separate form to HMRC to show that no inheritance tax is payable, or that inheritance tax is payable, but in this case it is not. So you can do it all online. You do need to send in the will and the copy of the death certificate by post, and that goes separately. Obviously, you pay the probate fees quite a lot of money. It's I think it was something like £265. That's not exactly right, but it's close to that. When you submit online, you pay that fee, and then you can pay, I think it's £1.50 for every extra copy of the probate that you might want. So if you've got 5 organisations that might need probate, you might want to get five copies of the official copies of the probate. You don't need to do that, because often you can do the important ones first and they will send them back to you, or you might even go for example, if it's a bank, you might have an appointment at a bank and give them the probate application, and then they'll just give it straight back to you having copied it. But £1.50, so you might as well get it if you're paying £265 anyway. Now on the application, this is where I got conflicting advice. There's basically 2 parts where you value the estate. One part values the estate for inheritance tax purposes, to show that there's no inheritance tax payable, and in that you show the gross assets, the net assets, and the value of the assets for inheritance tax purposes. Now, the gross assets are basically the total assets owned by the person who died, plus their share of joint assets. So if you've got joint bank accounts or a joint property, it would include their share, i.e. 50% of that property in those bank accounts, along with their individual assets. That's the gross. The net is taking off liabilities, like maybe you've got a Barclaycard bill or something like that, or you owe something. And then the inheritance tax value is, now for example, if everything was going to the spouse, everything would be exempt, so it would be zero. as in some cases, you might have what was termed a nil rate discretionary band trust, especially if it's an old will, going back, I think it was 2007. If it's before 2007, then there may well be a discretionary nil rate band trust in the will, which is basically assets transferred to the spouse, except for the value of the nil rate band, which goes into a trust for the benefit of whoever the trust is for the benefit of. Now, importantly, you've got to look at, it's normally the nil rate band minus the value of gifts in the last 7 years. I'm not going to get into detail of that. But so you might, in other words, you might not have a nil value, but as long as it's under the nil rate band, 325,000 minus certain gifts in the last 7 years, then it would still be no inheritance tax payable, but that would nevertheless be the value. Now, that's quite complicated, but you can do it still. You can do it yourself online. You can get a solicitor to do it, but you can do it yourself. The thing I got conflicting advice was the next part of the form then asks for the value of the estate for the purpose of the will, and for the executors to actually administer the will. Now, one person said to me at the probate office that it should be the same value as the value you've just put in for the inheritance tax, the gross value. To me, that seemed, well, in that case, why ask for a separate figure? And it didn't seem quite right. And it also, if you read the guidance on the application form, that isn't quite what it says. Now, it doesn't. When I explain why I think this is, it makes more sense. But you're not, for the administration of the will, you're not looking at the value for inheritance tax purposes. Because remember what I was saying earlier on about joint assets. Where you've got joint assets and the ownership passes directly to